Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
And I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today, June 11th, 2019, with my special guest, Lorena Inclan, Action News Jax.
Hey everybody,
Back
good to
again.
be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming out again. I think it's so important that we go back through these cases that you've shared with Action News Jax, and you've put these segments on, showed these families.
It helps us too, jogs our memory.
It does. Yeah. We always go back, rewatch the segment, re-listen to the podcast, go back through our notes to try to make sure that we can bring this awareness back out into the public eye.
Yeah, and it also helps us I need to, I reminds myself to ask JSO about that.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Like, did they,
right.
And we'll talk about that a little bit today too. Anyway, just a couple of quick things before we get started. Make sure you stay tuned to the end. We're doing this new thing now where we show remembrances, all the victims that have been submitted to us that passed away, that were murdered from today till next Monday. We show a little slideshow of those clips for a couple reasons. One, so those families, the victims are honored, the families see them, and gosh, like always, if anybody recognizes the victim and has information, they can call. The other thing I want to say before we get going too much is we've got a scholarship, $1,000 scholarship to any college, any university, any trade school in the country. There doesn't have to be a connection to an unsolved murder, but we've teamed up with DJ7 here locally, had some businesses, Group 4 Design, some philanthropic friends, the Lucius family, donate to that scholarship. But that deadline is July 1st. So visit our website if you or anyone you know is looking for a little extra money to go to secondary education. Awesome. projectcoldcase.org/scholarship. And now we'll thanks for letting us get that out there quick. But I want to get into today's recap story. We're talking about James Marlowe Weaver. He was a Navy veteran, a father, a brother, a son, a husband. And he was a manager at the Fleetwood Mobile Home Park
off of Phillips
Highway.
Which is still called that.
Which is still called that, yeah. That's kind of who we're going to be talking about today, and I want to go ahead and show the segment that you ran so that everybody gets a synopsis of the entire story, and then we'll go into more details. So let's show that segment.
James Weaver was a proud Navy veteran. He was 38 years old when he and his wife moved to Fleetwood Mobile Home Park on Phillips Highway, where he worked as the manager. It's where on May 26, 1985, Weaver was attacked.
It was blunt force trauma to the head.
Detective Ray Reeves has now taken over the case. These are photos from the scene back in 1985 showing opened money drawers and a safe. Detective Reeves says the killer got in through this back door by unlocking it from the outside.
There was some cash. It was in the cash boxes in the manager's office, and the boxes were left, but they had pulled out from the drawer. They were opened.
Weaver's body was discovered by his wife and her daughter. The only witness to the crime was a 9-month-old baby boy, Weaver's grandson, who was left in his care.
There could have potentially been 2 homicides that day.
The mobile home park still bears the same name today as it did back then, and this is where Weaver lived with his family. It's still standing and functioning as an office, but the crime scene is effectively gone, making it challenging for detectives working on this case today. But there was one thing found on Weaver's body back then that was out of place, and it could be key.
There would have been no reason for him to have that piece of evidence on his body. To be left there at the scene, whoever's DNA that matches up to will have some explaining to do for sure.
Detective Reeves would not elaborate on what that evidence is because it's something only the killer would know. But JSO is also looking to track down 6 people who still need to be interviewed, including someone who got into an argument with Weaver earlier that afternoon.
We also have some DNA that was collected at the time, some swab, and potentially some lift cards or latent prints, fingerprints.
We reached out to Weaver's brother who lives in Louisiana. He tells me he's thankful someone is still looking into his brother's case after all these years.
We just like to know that something was done, or that everything that could be done was done.
Nearly 33 years after Weaver's murder, JSO believes it's getting closer to the truth.
The victims and their families deserve a resolution.
Lorena Inclan, CBS 47, Action News Jax.
All right, so now everybody is caught up on the big picture of James Weaver's murder. It was May 26th, 1985. Mr. Weaver is 38 years old. He's the manager at the mobile home park. His wife and daughter go to the hospital, at like after midnight.
Yes, they're older. The older daughter of the wife, she was 20 at the time, wasn't feeling well.
Right.
And they went and they took the family's only car to the hospital.
So they have this timeline here of, they leave, Mr. Weaver's alive. He's left in the care of his grandson.
Or the grandson is left in his care.
Oh, the grandson is left in his care.
Yeah, he was 9-month-old.
9-month-old.
It's just the two of them.
And 3 o'clock in the morning, his wife and her daughter return.
Yes, and find him. He's dead in the hallway there. He's been beaten to death. It's a gruesome scene.
Yeah, blunt force trauma to the head, beat to death. There appears to be robbery as a motive. As you mentioned in the segment, they had the back door had these louvered windows.
Right, we all remember those, right, from the 80s. It's so easy to pop them open, and they believe that that's what the killer did.
That's what somebody did. Reached through, was able to unlock the door, get in. There's money drawers that are open with stuff missing. There's a safe that's open.
Because his home is also his office.
Right. Yeah.
So
when you're the manager of that park, you live in the office. And I guess that's one of the perks is you have a place to stay for free or cheap. We have this window of 3 hours where the family leaves and then comes back. Robbery appears to be at least partially the motive.
Right.
Now, when you did the segment, you did a podcast as well.
We did.
Which is like a 45-minute, a much longer, more detailed version of the story, which includes Detective Ray Reeves' interview in full.
Right. It reveals a lot of
me. And an interview with the family, with James's brother, Richard, and so we get into a lot more details. And like we mentioned earlier, you and I always go back. We listen to the podcast. We watch the segment. We check back to our notes. We make sure that we,
we remember all the details.
We remember all the details. And one of the things that was mentioned was that James Weaver had gotten into an argument earlier that day with somebody else, somebody
who lives in the
in the park. So, there was a number of persons of interest, I guess, that the detective now, Ray Reeves, wanted to go back and re-interview. And he actually says there's like 6 people.
A total of 6 people.
Including that person that the argument happened with.
And they're not sure if everybody's still alive.
Right.
But they believe that a few of them at least are still alive, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they had anything to do with the murder,
Right.
but they may have some information, and they weren't interviewed at the time.
Right, and they said that the person that I remember the person that had been in the argument was nowhere to be found afterwards.
Right,
so
I believe.
I don't know that they ever actually got a statement from him.
Right. And again, I mean, that person potentially may not have anything to do with it, but I do remember from interviewing Detective Reeves that he was pretty confident that among those 6 people, one of them holds the key.
Yeah, and Detective Reeves mentions there was some physical evidence that was at the scene that would not have been able to be tested in 1985. That kind of technology didn't exist, but the evidence was actually collected.
The evidence was collected, and it was interesting how Detective Reeves put it. He said one of these things don't belong.
Yeah.
And he talked about the Sesame Street,
Right.
that I actually said that. Remember,
that was
as a kid,
tagline. Yeah.
One of these things don't belong, and that was one of the things that was on the victim's body, on James Weaver's body, that was foreign to him.
Right.
That there was no reason why he should have that on his body.
On his body.
And it was DNA.
And it was DNA. So we have the ability now to test things that were collected at a scene like that. Now, sometimes we're scrambling to figure out what case we're going to do, what we're going to review, and my fault. I last second tried to reach out to the JSO cold case office this morning, and just see if they had anything that they could add that we could maybe give an update on, and they did not. So, and I don't know if that was because they were in the middle of something and didn't have time to break away. Detective Reeves is no longer in the cold case unit. He's back up on the hot homicide teams. So my understanding is he still has ownership of these cases, cold cases, from when he was down there. But I don't know if it was a situation where they, didn't have time to reach out to Detective Reeves and get an answer on, any updates, or if they don't have updates. We don't know what that was. Like I said, it was very last minute.
Yep.
My fault reaching out late. I should have done it last week at least, and tried to get something that we could have provided, because when you listen to the podcast and your segment, JSO was they thought this was going to be a case that they could the evidence would lead to a suspect, and
they're really confident about this.
They were very confident about this, and I just don't know where it stands. We haven't been able to do a follow-up with them on that.
And just for some perspective, this story aired, I believe, April of last year, so it's a little bit more than a year since the story aired.
And when you're submitting evidence from a cold case to the state lab, it can take a little while to get that back.
Yes, it's a lengthy process.
It is a lengthy process. So it's not that it's way out of character, but I think when you couple that, it's been over a year now, with the fact that, and Detective Reeves was pretty clear. He was going to the evidence room that day. I think that you met
that we
with
interviewed him.
Yeah,
yep,
and
that's
so they had not physically pulled the evidence and not submitted it to the lab yet as of that interview. So when you take that into account, with the fact that he was then transferred from cold case back to a hot team, that could indicate that could be part of the delay.
I'm really interested to see, if they were able to submit anything and what came from it, because Detective Reeves, as you can see from the interview, and if you go ahead and listen to the podcast, he was very confident that this was a very promising case in terms of being able to solve it, even though it was from 1985.
Yeah, it was 1985.
And just the DNA that they were able to recover, and some physical evidence that was intact, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
This is one of those cases that really makes you think, like, everything about it just screams like this could be solved. And I believe that they are close. It's just a matter of getting that information back, and hopefully somebody watching this again jogs their memory, because again that mobile home park still has the same name. It's the same exact home where Mr. Weaver lived. I mean, you saw me standing in front of it. It has not changed that much. And I walked into that mobile home that day, and the people who worked there didn't want to go on camera, but you walk in there and they knew exactly what I was talking about. They said, yeah, it happened here in this mobile home, and they were kind of like showing me. So people remember. People who live in that mobile home remember.
That's a good thing to know, because the fear is always that, people rotate in and out of that park, that the management changes, employees change, and people that live there change, and that eventually there's no one there that has any recollection of that event. Nobody knows what you're talking about when you come in. So to know that, as late as last year, when you went in there, they all still had knowledge of his murder.
And people talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, there very well could be people still living there.
Right. Absolutely.
That remember.
And just so people know, this wasn't, all murders are violent by nature.
Yeah.
In this case, Mr. Weaver was beaten to death multiple times to the head. He was beaten to the head with an object.
Yeah, which they don't have.
And they don't have the murder weapon.
They don't know what that object was.
Right. And there was some sort of a scuffle, of a
very violent
fight,
struggle.
Right.
And again,
and there was a baby
with a 9-month-old baby
in there as well
that entire time.
Yeah. The only witness, a 9-month-old child.
Yeah. We tried to reach out to the family early on with this case from what we were doing, and we really were having a hard time finding family members. And we were calling people. You were trying to track people down. JSO was trying to find survivor contact information. We eventually do end up making contact with James Weaver's brother, Richard, and his wife, and they live in Louisiana. And there is a long interview with you in the podcast, and obviously some clips on the segment as well. And he kind of talks about how out of the loop they were, because technically James Weaver is married. There's his family that he has here. They were the ones that would have been kind of the points of contact, and it would have been up to them to share that information with the rest of the family. And the way Richard describes it is that these families they didn't communicate anymore after this happened. They got the initial call.
Which, by the way, it happens a lot with the families that we meet after the murder, after the incident that is so traumatic in a family. They kind of lose touch after that.
They do, and one of the struggles we have is that if they don't keep the contact with law enforcement and let them know, hey, we've moved. Hey, I got a new phone number. Again, we're talking 1985. People now have the same cell phone number from the time they get a cell phone, forever. But in 1985, you had a house number. And if you moved,
you lost that house number.
Lost that number, and that's exactly what happened here with these families. Is they would move and not keep in touch with each other. There was no way for Richard to call, the family.
Right.
It was difficult to find them, which is something law enforcement deals with. That's why we always tell families to make sure that you reach out and update your contact information.
It made me, really think about what law enforcement goes through, because it was so difficult to track down even one family member.
Yeah.
So sometimes family members are like, well, how come nobody reached out to me or this and that? But it's, sometimes it's hard to track you down.
It is. And here we are a year later. We still don't have any contact with James Weaver's wife or the children that were in that house, or grandchildren that were in that house.
Yep.
I remember
not been able to locate them.
Yeah, and I remember you doing a call out, in the segment and saying, in the podcast, like if any of you are hearing this, reach out to us. We need your contact information.
And that's the beauty of social media. If you happen to know anybody in the Weaver family, you never know. We could be talking to somebody who who may be friends with them. Please let them know. We would love to talk to them.
This was kind of a cool occurrence during this. While all of this was coming together and you were doing this segment, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office had submitted James Weaver's case to the Cold Case Advisory Commission for the state of Florida, and that's
which is a big deal.
It's put on by the Florida Sheriff's Association. They meet quarterly. They review cases. And this, we had Clint pull this clip from your. I hope people will go back and listen to the podcast. The podcast has so much information, but we pulled this clip from the podcast. So I'm going to let Clint play this, and then we'll talk about it.
And Mr. Weaver, the case is also going to be presented in front of a cold case advisory commission where dozens of experts from the state of Florida get together and try to figure out ways to potentially solve a cold case. And your brother's case is going to be presented. I'm not sure if you knew that.
I didn't know for sure.
Yeah, it's going to be one of the cases that will be presented in June. Does it give you hope that even after all these years, the case is still being looked at and worked on?
Yes, ma'am.
So that was this whole, like, you broke the news to him. You know what I mean? You told him.
It was heartbreaking.
Did you know that the Cold Case Advisory Commission is going to watch? And the emotion in his voice, and
the 6 people that they wanted to talk to, and how they have DNA evidence. I mean,
he really hadn't, and he was obviously someone that didn't feel the need to reach out to law enforcement regularly and get updates. We have a lot of families that call regularly and frequently, sometimes to their frustration and law enforcement's frustration because there just is no new information. But you were telling him things that he didn't know, that he hadn't heard. But he
told me something that I didn't know either, and during that podcast. And hopefully you'll go back and listen to it. But he mentioned somebody connected to the family that at the time they thought was involved.
A suspect. There was an in-law or something.
A brother-in-law.
Married.
And we told JSO about that.
Yeah. And that's another reason why we really need to sit down with JSO and review these ones that we've already put the information out there, because did any new tips come in? Did any new leads come in? I told you this morning a family member came into our office unexpectedly. That was another case that you had done. I don't want to mention it just because we're working on it, but they had some new information that they had gathered on their own from talking to people that were around then. And so it's really good that we reconnect and bring back up these stories. There was another segment in the podcast that I want to share with everybody about your conversation with Richard and what it would mean to him. And we play that for us, Clint.
What would it mean to you, Mr. Weaver, for your brother's case to be solved?
Everything in the world.
Would that bring you closure?
I think it might. It would help. See, there's only 2 of us left, myself and my older sister. Now all the rest of them have passed on.
So, again, the emotion in Richard Weaver's voice when you ask him what it would mean to him if this case got solved. And, unfortunately, we reached out to the family to let them know that we were going to be doing this podcast and to check up on him recently. And we learned that Richard passed away in October.
And I just found that out today. That's so sad that he didn't get to see his brother's case get solved.
No, he didn't. He was one of, I think, 4 brothers in that family. James was murdered. Richard passed away in October. The other 2 brothers had passed away prior to Richard passing. I think there's 1 living sibling left of James Weaver, a sister, and then of course there's his wife and that family that we don't have contact with. And Richard has some children that they've we've gotten their contact information, so we'll have connections to the family, but we're starting to lose these people that were that was what they wanted to see. You ask them if it would bring closure, and he said, well, I think so, or it sure would help, and he didn't get that opportunity.
It's heartbreaking.
It really was sad. I knew that he had passed. I was going to give you that information, and then when I was listening to the podcast, re-listening to it, and hearing the emotion in his voice, when you ask him those questions, it just was it's kind of heartbreaking, to know that we were so close.
I know, it really is. And it almost felt like he felt defeated, throughout the interview. It felt like he was really sad, and he missed his brother.
Yeah, and you had brought it up, like what was was it shocking to get these phone calls, all of a sudden out of the blue, and he kind of admits that, he's like, I've done a little bit of research. I had reached out a couple times to a couple people, and now all of a sudden, and we've seen this a number of times. There's like this, we're experiencing it on another case, the Missy Ellison case right now, because it's like these cases have sat, with no attention for decades, and then it starts the ball rolling, when we get involved and we reach out to law enforcement, and then we reach out to the media, and then a news segment is done, and then a spotlight is done on our website, and then a Facebook Live follow-up, and these families call and they go, we've received more publicity, in the last 3 months than the last 30 years. And
think about that. In the last 30 years.
And media, you can speak to this, has changed so much from 1985, what I mean, to now.
We have so much more reach now, just thanks to social media.
Yeah, I mean, who
and
knows?
People, and this, I mean, people could just watch the news on their phone, so.
Yeah, who knows what kind of publicity this case got, back in 1985, because we couldn't find any newspaper articles or, archive footage, but that was it. Then it was out of the public eye for all those years.
Right. And now you Google his name and you'll find our story in the podcast. And I really, and we've said it a few times already, but I really encourage you to listen to the podcast, especially if you're somebody who used to live in that community, maybe know the family members. Go ahead and listen back. It may help you remember some things and really, just try to bring closure to the family. It's so important.
It's about 45 minutes, 44 minutes, the podcast total, but it's broken into little segments that's like, you will hear the entire interview you did with Detective Ray Reeves.
And then we'll hear the interview with you.
Yeah, I did a little bit with you. We talked about the struggles of finding this family and contacting them and helping them out. And then the full interview with Richard Weaver, who has since passed away, unfortunately.
This story, I think, was unique in the sense that it was presented in a room full of experts at the Cold Case Advisory Commission.
So just a little background, on that commission. It was started by the Florida Sheriff's Association back in like 2015, 2016. It's made up of, it's a multidisciplinary group of experts in their field. So it's Sheriff Sadie Darnell from Alachua County is the chair. Sheriff Chris Nacco from Pasco County is a vice chair, along with Sheriff Tommy Ford from out in Bay County area in the Panhandle is another vice chair. And this commission meets quarterly, 4 times a year, and we, with the goal, and I say we because I'm actually on the commission. I'm the only survivor civilian, advocate that's been appointed to that commission, but it's mostly made up of homicide detectives, DNA analysts and scientists from the state labs, medical examiners, forensic pathologists, state attorneys, statewide prosecutors.
It's so incredible to have everybody, all of the brains that know and have so much knowledge.
We should do
subject matter experts is what they're called.
Subject matter experts. And what I need to do is I need to write a note for myself. We have a meeting coming up next month, and I need to collectively find out how many years of experience is in that room.
It's got to be hundreds.
It's got to be hundreds of years of experience, prosecuting cases, investigating cases, testing physical evidence,
knowing what works, what doesn't.
And so it's, we only meet 4 times a year, and we only typically review 4 cases per meeting. So, 16 cases per year if we get them all. And sometimes we've had people, back out at the last second or not be able to attend. But if you can imagine, there's probably estimated 15,000 unsolved murders in the state of Florida, and we're reviewing 16 of them a year.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And this was one of them.
And it's not because we don't want to do more. If you can imagine trying to get all of those heads in one place at one time to review this stuff. It's difficult to do, and there's no compensation for anybody on that commission, so they have to travel on their own, meet on their own, and pay for a hotel and lodging on their own.
Ryan, how extensive is the review of a case? Does it take hours or?
Yeah, so we typically the meetings are 2 days, and the first day is set up as a training. A lot more for any law enforcement agency that wants to come in and learn about some policies and best practices with investigating cold cases. And we have kind of a business meeting tied in with that, with what we're trying to accomplish and some of the goals. And then the second day is typically dedicated to all the review meetings.
So it's the whole day to review.
So a whole day for those 4 cases. So put typically somewhere between an hour and 2 hours per case presented. The investigating agency will send a representative, typically the lead detective, that will come in with a PowerPoint presentation. We'll go through from start to finish the investigation, when it happened, who it happened to, victimology, investigation, what's been tested, what hasn't been tested, are there suspects, why they're suspects, excuse me, the participation by the state attorney's office in that area, whether they believe there's enough evidence to move forward, what they need to move forward. The investigator gets to ask questions of, what else can I do to solve this case?
So important.
And it's amazing. It's not open to the public. You can't come into that meeting unless you're on the commission or an invited guest. But I can tell you from being in there that it's amazing to see the light bulb go off in different people's heads. Sometimes it's the investigator for the medical examiner's office, and they say, well, we collect blood evidence on every victim that comes in, because it might be a case where they don't have the victim's DNA to eliminate the victim from the suspect's DNA, and the medical examiner will say, well, we keep blood spot cards from every autopsy that we do. You need to call your medical examiner and find out if they do that, and if they do, there's your DNA to eliminate them from a mixture or whatever. And the same with the DNA scientist, the analyst. They sit there with their laptops, and she'll pull up the case and she'll say, okay, well, this hasn't been looked at in 10 years. Nothing's been submitted to us. We have technology now that can do that. And you just start to see, and the detectives up there frantically taking notes, and what's your name again? So that they can reach back out. And that's just on top of the investigative techniques that all of that experience has. So sometimes they'll say, well, have you gone back and interviewed X? Have you contacted the ex-boyfriend or girlfriend of the suspect, because maybe they've broken up and now they might be willing to talk? And it really is just a brainstorming session of collective geniuses when it comes to cold cases. And James Weaver's case was one of those, and I was able to sit in on that. And like I said, unfortunately I can't share everything that was in there, because a lot of it is significant for future prosecution, hopefully. Of
that
the
is
case.
the goal at the end of the day.
But I can tell you that there's a lot of information that was provided. There was a lot of information that was a lot of solutions that were offered and other options in this case.
So it went well.
It went very well, and I believe, based on your interview with Detective Ray Reeves and that cold case advisory commission meeting, I fully believe that the evidence is there. It's a matter of all those pieces coming together, identifying those 6 persons that they wanted to talk to, getting that evidence actually tested, and where those two things meet. Where does that physical evidence and these interviews, Detective Reeves mentioned it in the podcast. One of these things is not like the other, and one of these things, when I start talking to these 6 people with the combination of that physical evidence and these 5 people, or 6 people, 5 of them are going to have no idea what I'm talking about,
one of them
and
will.
one of them is going to be in for
Exactly.
a bad day.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
So,
And that's the importance of trying to track down all the people that he and 6 people is a lot of people.
It
try to
is.
talk to.
It is. I mean, from
Yeah.
1985, and they've all, you know, who knows where they came from or
Right.
you know, where they
Right.
were going,
and who knows if this killer has reoffended since then. I mean, we're talking about a span of more than 3 decades.
Yeah.
So
to find the podcast,
Yes.
Go to Action News Jacks / Project Cold Case.
Yeah. ActionNewsJacks.com
/ Project Cold Case. You can go to Action News Jack's homepage. At the top, there is it, what is it, Clint, that when you go to the Action News Jack's page, there's a button at the top that is investigates, and there's a Project Cold Case link there.
Correct. And I think this was case 9, if I'm not mistaken. But you'll see James Weaver's name there.
You'll see that picture of him in his military jacket.
Yeah.
You know,
case number 9.
And it's case number 9.
And
Again,
it's SoundCloud. You can actually listen to it right there on that webpage, or you can listen to it on SoundCloud.
and you can subscribe to that, and hopefully we'll get some new ones on there, you know, soon. But again, actionnewsjacks.com / Project Cold Case will get you, and that will be all of those podcasts, you know, that we have done in the past that you've produced, and so you can go back and listen to those. You can watch the stories that we showed you today, but you can go back through those and check them all out.
The importance of the podcast is because we don't get I don't get that much time to be able to put everything on the TV story. So the podcast, it could be as long as we want.
Yeah,
and
I think
put
this
everything
is
in there.
really cool. You and I talk about this. It gives a little glimpse into your world. You know, we that day we came out to your station. Detective Reeves, I was there. Sergeant Jansen was there. We did your interview with Detective Reeves, your interview with me. We leave. You have to call the family. You get all that. And then you're typically turning these things around that evening, you know.
Exactly, yeah.
So you have.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And also I have to go through
the scene?
Yes, we go to the scene.
So.
Yep. It takes a long time to put it together. I wish it was as easy as, you know, a couple of hours and everything's done, but it's the gathering process takes hours, even days. So it is a lengthy process, and a lot of people ask me, oh, you know, why is the interview so long? You're only going to do a story of 1 minute. Well, I need all that information to be able to tell the story, and I'd rather have it on record so I could go back and refer to it, and then it's easier for me to write the story when I have it all in front of me. Also, it gets put in the podcast.
Right.
The entire thing.
Right. Yeah, no, it works. But again, you need that information. You're trying to tell a story, and I'm sure it's difficult to have to edit all of that down and find those key parts that you can throw in there.
That's the difficult part. I try to put the most, you know, pertinent information in the TV story, and then I you know, that's why it has to be condensed. But it's difficult because I don't get that much time. But the podcast, I'm able to put everything in there, and that's why I really urge you to go back. And there's so many details that we probably don't have time to cover today that this case has that I think could really, really benefit people who go and listen to it, and potentially could help.
Absolutely.
Call Crime Stoppers if you know anything. And also, one quick thing, Ryan, families who know of a cold case or have a family member whose case is unsolved, this Cold Case Advisory Commission, they should talk to their detective about that.
Absolutely. So we encourage you, if you would like your loved one's case to be presented to that commission, contact your lead detective.
Doesn't mean that it will be selected.
No, it doesn't mean that it will be. But if you let them know, share with them, ask them if they know that the Florida Sheriff's Association has a Cold Case Advisory Commission. All right. So this is not just some group of armchair detectives and true crime podcasters that are reviewing these cases. These are
detectives,
veterans.
Yes,
yeah. These are in that field and experts within that field. So you go to ask them if they know about the Florida Sheriff's Association's Cold Case Advisory Commission and request that your loved one's case be presented at one of their upcoming review meetings. There's a process, but there's a link on the Florida Sheriff's Association's website. Any of these detectives that work for a sheriff's office should have no problem figuring out, you know, how how to submit that information. They can always reach out to us as well, and I can point them in the right direction. And if your case is being investigated by a police department and not a sheriff's office, those cases can still be reviewed through the sheriff's office. There's just one extra hoop that the police department has to go through. But I think we've got I think I was told one of our cases coming up in July is from a police department. So the people involved in this want to help.
Absolutely.
This is not, oh gosh, I got to go meet with this thing. Everybody is doing it voluntarily. They're not being compensated. And when they show up at that meeting, it's because they want to be there and want to help.
The goal is to be able to solve it. I mean, it does no good to have that case sitting on somebody's desk. And the detectives want to be able to solve it and move on to the next one because they have a stack this big, unfortunately, of cold cases.
Exactly. So do we have any other questions, Clint? That was about it. So thanks, everybody, for watching today. Well, thank you, Lorena, for coming in and talking about this one again. It's so important to just keep getting these things back out in the public eye. And so I really appreciate that you take that seriously and are committed to that with us.
Anything that we can do together to solve one of these cases is
absolutely. So we're going to show, what are we going to show, Clint? We're going to show the remembrances. So again, these are the victims that have been submitted to our office from a family member or potentially law enforcement who were murdered at some point in the past during this week. So their anniversaries fall between June 11th and June 17th. And this is, again, just another way to get their faces back out there and hopefully to maybe jog a memory or two. So we'll show these, and then we will check in with you next week. Bye.